Hi everyone, I'm Bruce Moravchik, and welcome to the September broadcast of the NOAA Climate Stewards webinar. Tonight we're really pleased to have Dr. Martha Monroe, Professor of Environmental Education from the University of Florida. We'll begin in just a moment, just have a few slides and some information to go through for you first. Okay, so as most of you who've been here with us before know, tonight's broadcast is recorded, and I will be sending out a link to a video archive within about a week or less from this evening. If you don't receive a link, please send me an email just with the subject, request link to the September 2017 webinar. We do have a video archive, and all the slides that will be presented tonight and of previous broadcasts, they're going to be available on the NOAA Climate Stewards Google website with the link you see here. If you can't access the site, send an automated request through Google or send me an email with the subject, request access to CSEP Google site. You do have to have a Google account to be able to access it. For those of you who are with us for the entire hour of our broadcast, you will be receiving a certificate of attendance acknowledging your participation in one contact hour of professional development. And before we begin, all attendee microphones will be muted during the broadcast. Would you like to ask Dr. Monroe a question? Or perhaps myself or Peg Steffen, the coordinators this evening of NOAA Climate Stewards, a question? Type it into your GoToWebinar control panel. And also, during tonight's broadcast, you'll be receiving an email with a link to a post-webinar poll. Please go to your email right afterwards and respond to it. It does give us essential metrics and helps us to prepare for future events. And also, I'd like to remind everyone to save the following dates. On Monday, September 25th at 8 p.m., we're going to be having our next discussion group. And Peg Steffen, our coordinator, will be leading that. It's the Teacher's Friendly Guide to Climate Change. Now, this is a book by Drs. Ingrid Zabel, Don Dugan-Haas, and Robert Ross, and it's really a comprehensive tool for educators that focuses on the scientific aspects of climate change, how climate change works, why scientists think climate is changing, and the science and engineering behind steps that would mitigate climate change and enable humans to adapt to climate changes that are occurring. Now, although the focus is for high school educators, teachers of all ages, both formal and informal, can find scientifically accurate information and links to highly regarded resources. I encourage all of you to join in. It's going to be a really tremendous event. And you can download the entire publication free from this link. And we'll be sending the video archive around so you can copy this link later. If you want to join the discussion group, contact Peg Steffen at NOAA.gov. She'll tell you how to get on. Now, also Monday, October 2nd at 7:30 p.m., we have our next Climate Stewards webinar, Climate Communication, Teaching the Science and Rhetoric of Climate Change. We have Drs. Krista Heiser and Wendy Kuntz from the University of Hawaii. They have been working on an integrative program to teach both the, as it says, the science as well as the rhetoric of climate change. It's a tremendous program, and I really think that everyone who is interested in this evening's topic should most certainly come and join us there. Please stay tuned after Dr. Monroe's presentation. We have some additional closing information, and for you, so be sure to stay on the line. And right now, I'd like to turn the screen over to Dr. Monroe, as well as introduce her. For those of you who are not as familiar with Dr. Monroe, she is responsible for extension activities, research, and courses related to environmental education, conservation behavior, and human dimensions of wildland-urban interface issues. Her work includes the development and evaluation of curriculum resources for educators and understanding how people perceive issues such as wildfire and woody biomass in the South. She's exploring strategies for engaging people in helpful dialogue and productive change as we move toward sustainability. Dr. Monroe is committed to using education to help move communities and nations toward conservation behavior and sustainable systems. And with that, Dr. Monroe, you have the screen.
Well, thank you, Bruce, and welcome, everyone. It's good to be a part of this webinar series, and I appreciate very much the fact that this was delayed for a week to allow us to recover from Irma and cut down some trees and get back to normal here in Florida, although there's plenty of places that aren't quite back to normal yet. Before we get started, it would really be helpful to know a little bit about what kinds of folks are listening in today. So I have a few questions for you, and Bruce will flip us over to his system so that he can record your responses. But the first question is just, who are you? A K through 12 educator, a non-formal educator, someone involved in education in some other way, or other?
So please just click on your screen directly. We'll give just a few moments for everyone to log in, and then we'll show everyone the results. All right. That looks pretty good. So I'm going to close the poll now, and let's see who we have. Can you see that, Martha?
No. Where am I supposed to look?
Oh, it should be on your screen. It's probably beneath your presentation, your PowerPoint presentation. But I am showing it, and we see we have 28% K through 12 educators, 38% non-formal educators, 32% are involved in education in another way, and we have other with about 10%.
Okay. Well, that's good. We have lots of educators with us, and even more non-formal than public schools or private schools. So here's another question for you, and that is,
One moment.
sorry.
No, that's fine. Hang on.
Are you showing the second question?
I'm getting there. One moment. Okay. Here we go. What is your interest in climate education? So take just another moment to let us know. And if you have other, feel free to type that into the question log. Okay, we've got a good number of folks who are signed in now with just over 90%. I'm going to close the poll.
And people can check more than one, right?
Yes, of course. You may check more than one, but we've closed the poll, and these are our answers. We have 19% who said they might teach about climate change in the future, 51% who currently teach about climate change, 66% who want to improve how they teach about climate change, 53% who want to help others teach about climate change, and 9% are other.
Alrighty. Well, that's very helpful. I'm glad to know that about who's listening. So we will continue and get started. So, there. All right. So climate change is, whether or not you agree that it's happening, there is certainly plenty of evidence out there to suggest that we do have impact of climate change, changing precipitation patterns and temperature, of course, and storms. So there's lots of things going on out there. We are in the midst of seeing change. Many educators are, so Bruce, which screen are you seeing right now?
I see climate change brings challenges.
Okay, so you should be seeing something else. The climate change education slides. But I'm not quite sure how to make that happen. Oh. There. How's that?
Looks good.
Okay, thank you. Many educators are recognizing the importance of teaching about climate change, of course, and are engaging learners in lessons about climate science and mitigation and adaptation strategies. This can occur in classrooms and workshops, in nature centers, in zoos, and other community facilities around the world. There's a great deal of diversity in how information is conveyed and also in what information is conveyed. Many educators also are recognizing, oh, no, wait a second. Gee, there's something wrong with how this is working. All right, here we go. No, you're seeing increasing interest in climate change education?
Yes, I am.
All right. Somehow, this is getting all whipper-jappered. Well, we'll just talk about that slide then. So, despite or each about climate change, we have seen a huge and recent interest in research on climate change education. If you search on the terms climate change and education and limit the articles to that decade between 1990 and 1999, you'll only find 12 peer-reviewed research articles. But in the 6 years between 2010 and 2015, with the same terms, you will get over 1,500 articles. So that's just a lot of information that's out there. I would really like to know how I'm supposed to advance the screen.
Martha, if you are having difficulties, I can try and show it from my screen.
Well, should I be clicking resume slides every time? I'm supposed to, okay.
Let's move forward now.
Thanks. One might not think I have very much capability at this point in time, but actually I did lead a project to identify and review the articles that provided evidence of some kind of impact of climate change education. And our search turned up over 1,000 peer-reviewed articles written in English that had to do with climate change education. So we were looking at all those decades from 1990 to 2015. We were only searching through research journals because they're searchable. And we know that there's a lot of wisdom about climate change education in other places, like program evaluation reports and conference proceedings, and even in other languages, of course. So what we have to report on today is not the whole story of what's effective. It's just one chapter. So our search went through over 1,000 abstracts. We decided whether or not they would be in or out of the review process. That I am going to report on the common themes that resulted from those papers. This is the search, the decision tree that we used to select those 49 papers. We had a team of 5 people working on the project, and 2 people read each one of those 1,000 abstracts and decided if it met the search criteria. Our criteria included these 4 questions at the top of the screen. Is it a peer-reviewed paper? Does it meet our formatting requirements? Is it about climate change? Does it test an intervention? And does it report on those outcomes? Most of the abstracts, you can see, the 475 and the 311, were excluded from our system because they merely mentioned the words climate change education, saying it would be important and we ought to have it and this is what ought to happen, but it didn't actually test an intervention and report on something. So the papers met our criteria. We had 66. We read all of those and then decided again, well, did they really meet the criteria? Because in the beginning we were just using the abstracts, not the whole papers. And 14 failed on that account, and 3 we weren't sure were actually going to be quality that we could include. So that got us down to a final sample of 49 papers. From there, we identified 6 themes And I'm going to report on those 6 themes in 3 categories because it's easier to remember 3 than 6. This was called a systematic review of the literature, which means anybody should be able to get the same 49 articles if they use the same criteria that we did. So it can be a robust process to synthesize the literature. Let me stop there for a minute and see if there's any questions that Bruce wants to relate to me about the details of the study, just to make sure everybody's on the same page we did.
Thanks, Martha. And while people have any questions that they might be thinking about putting in, one question that I'd like to ask are, can you go into a little bit more detail regarding the education intervention that you were looking to, that you were seeing if was included in the papers?
Sure. We didn't search on the kind of intervention. We just wanted there to be some kind of actual program or educational activity that was conducted and evaluated. Most of them were in schools, but we had one that was a festival. I think it took place in the United Kingdom, where there was an exhibit that people walked through and made a commitment to reduce their carbon emissions. There were university classes, there were teacher training programs. We excluded things that were mass media surveys. So we didn't call a survey an intervention. They had to be an educational program of some sort.
Okay, and I guess, you know, one question that we have was, were there any journals or avenues that provided the predominance for these sort of 49 articles that you found?
Well, that's actually on the very next slide. That, if I resume the slideshow.
Okay, and before we get to that,
okay.
The question was this just formal education K through 12, or did it include K through 16 and the public?
Okay, that's also on the next slide.
Oh, all right. So, all right. Yeah. All right. Moving on.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay.
It's good. So, 28 of the articles were K-12 schools. 11 of them were universities. So the vast majority are classroom-based education. Elementary was not very typical. There were 1 or 2 elementary, so most of them are middle school and high school. But there were also out-of-school youth and teacher training programs and a few non-formal settings. There was a botanical garden. There was this festival that I mentioned. And there was a summer camp. So, and one of them was even an online course. So there was a diversity of educational materials, but most of them were classroom. About half of the papers were programs that occurred in the United States, and 12 other nations were represented in the other half. They all reported positive changes in knowledge, attitudes, and behavior. So they were all successful in some way. Our course was, what did those authors think made them successful? So that was what we were exploring. We did not subdivide the group of 49 papers to compare them against each other. So we didn't say, what's different between the United States and everybody else in the world? We kept them all together as one large group of 49 papers. So Bruce, were there other questions about the study that we should answer before I go on?
Oh, well, you know, there is one other question, which is by Abby Rusky, and they ask, so 893 of 1,489 published between 2010 and 2015 were eliminated, leaving 49 credible climate change education studies and papers. So what's that telling us about the state of climate change education research or paper writing, I suppose?
Well, Abby, you're good with the math. Let me just clarify a couple things. The 1,500 papers are the citations that you get when you search on climate change and education. We actually narrowed the search a little bit more than that because we wanted an educational intervention. So we went through the abstracts for only 1,000 papers. And of those 1,000, the vast majority of them were papers that said climate change education is important. And remember, these are research papers, so they might have been doing research on some brand of science education that wasn't exactly a test of a climate change program. So we were looking very specifically for something, we were looking for evidence that climate change was, well, what evidence do we see that accounts for success in climate change education? So I guess that's what it's telling us, is that a lot of educators know doesn't necessarily end up in peer-reviewed research articles. And what does end up in peer-reviewed research articles may not always be about climate change education. It's possible that we missed great things out there just because of how the search was done or how the abstract was written, because, you know, 950 of these fell out because we only read the abstract. So there's some squishiness in the system, but it does mean that 49 papers we found worth reading and synthesizing and reporting on. So does that help?
Well, we'll wait for Abby's answer, but why don't you move forward?
Okay.
Thank you for that.
Thanks. Sure. Okay, so the goals also varied in these papers. The purposes varied, the goals varied. The vast majority of them focused on climate science and science literacy and climate literacy. So the things that we all know from the NOAA literacy guide are the things that people were teaching. Some of the programs also empowered learners to affect change and got kids doing action projects, which is also part of the NOAA Climate Stewards program. And a smaller minority of papers were using climate change as a tool to help learners think about changing the world. So that's some of the things that were being talked about. So here is the first broad category of our 3 themes. And you can think about whether or not this is relevant to you and how it fits with what you teach. First category say that the ways how teachers conveyed climate science that made it effective is that it's relevant, interesting, and engaging. And the interesting thing about this is that I think we already know that. I think that science educators and environmental educators know that relevance and interest are essential for learning. It's just the way we need to teach. But because climate change is distant and global and hard to measure, at least for some educators, it's more challenging to make it relevant and engaging. The educators in these papers found ways to link climate change to either impacts or risk, most often to agriculture or coastlines or ecosystems. They didn't just talk about carbon and temperature, they talked about water and food. In many cases, students also collected data, analyzed it, and looked at trends. And sometimes they interacted with scientists as well. These are the strategies to increase the relevance and make those impacts more meaningful to students. Bruce, I'm finding that every time I have to click the resume slideshow, I must be doing something wrong, but I'll just keep looking for that little button and click on it. So sorry that this is a little bit disjointed. So I also think that this approach to learning science by doing science, it helps learners come to their own conclusions about the climate trends, which is very important. Here's an example from one of the 49 studies. Students looked at their ecological footprint and realized that their energy use created carbon emissions, and that affected the climate, which is something we hope that they learn somewhere along the line. But they actually measured the difference between students that had that piece of the activity and students that didn't have that piece of the activity. And they were able to report that using that ecological footprint helped make climate change personal and relevant and increase their understanding and increase their willingness to do something about it. Teachers used a variety of strategies to make their lessons experiential and engaging, such as role plays and videos and debates and worksheets and computer models. Here's another example of one of the papers, and this time it's an evaluation of university classes in remote sensing. The instructor taught students to use data from GIS programs and satellites to map snow cover and also deforestation. Pre- and post-tests showed that students' content knowledge increased significantly, and students reported increases in their awareness and confidence and understanding about climate change. So to summarize our first theme of relevant, interesting, data-based education, educators used a variety of strategies to meet these goals. They used personal and local impacts, engaging and experiential activities, and collected or analyzed their own data to help learners draw their own conclusions. And of course, all these strategies work together. Collecting your own data makes the activity relevant, and local topics tend to be interesting. And analyzing and making sense out of data makes it interesting and relevant. So all these things are tied up together. So what I'd like to do next is go to another question and ask you all, is this at all surprising, or is it pretty much you already do these things? You already make it relevant and local, and please check on more than one of these boxes if you want to. You already use engaging exercises, you already have students collect data or analyze data, or could you do more or better at one of these?
Very good. The votes are coming in. Again, please select as many of these as are relevant to you. We'll take just another few moments before we close the poll, and we'll see what people do. For those of you who have already voted, if you have any questions you'd like to ask Dr. Monroe over the course of the webinar, please feel free to enter them into the question panel at any time, and we'll get to them. Very good. We're going to close up and take a look at our results. And it looks like 67% already use local relevant impacts, 65% already use engaging exercises, 35% already have students collect data, and 45% already have students analyze data, but 82% feel that they could do better on at least one of these things.
Okay, well that's helpful. Thank you all. So here is our second category, and the second big theme is that our reviews suggested that for some papers it wasn't enough to convey climate science. Educators should actually empower learners to work toward change. And doing that tended to involve learning skills, debating options, and doing projects. Those projects could be class assignments, like conducted within the school system, or they could be outside the school in community activities. I think this is good environmental education or education for sustainable development. It's just a little bit more challenging in the context of climate change. So here are some examples about what people did. For the school projects, the assignments might have been things like writing a short message for a radio station, a PSA, or making videos to convey climate change implications. That particular instructor showed the videos to the public. They had a community event where people could come watch the videos that the students made. Projects like that help learners gain skills and understand the impact of scale so that they were using their efforts to an effect an appropriate local problem, as opposed to feeling depressed that they couldn't solve global climate change all by themselves. In the community projects, some educators use field experiences to connect learners with those at risk of impacts of climate change. And in that case, students worked with farmers to help them adapt their farming strategies. Some students also completed community projects that enabled them to increase their confidence and efficacy. In this example, in Canada, educators helped 13 and 14-year-old students research local climate change impacts and then share their findings with others through pamphlets and videos, and then implement action projects. Those included a Lunch Without Waste project and planting trees with the signs of their value to the ecosystem. So I guess they also made signs so they can plant the signs with the trees. The authors measured changes in students' ideas about a variety of aspects of climate change, including impacts to the local region and also their personal lives, and noted that the action projects encouraged the emergence of feelings of empowerment relating to the capacity to make a difference. And actually, in the work that I've been doing around measuring hope and hopefulness in the context of climate change, that's the key thing. I think that it's possible to learn a lot about climate change and feel very depressed and very unempowered. And figuring out ways to have people learn about climate change and feel empowered is very important in our educational system. So here's another example, two examples actually. In England, youth tackled school energy efficiency and got schools to save energy and money across their school district. In Greece, students took the message home and helped conserve energy and reduce greenhouse gases at home. Pre- and post surveys showed changes to energy efficient behaviors for both the students and their parents after participating in the program. So if we could go back to the poll again, the question is around this point number 2, do you think you already do or could do a school project? Do you do or could do a community project? Are you just not interested in doing a project at all because of the challenges and barriers to project-based learning? And are you interested in learning more about conducting projects related to climate change? How are we doing, Bruce?
Almost 90% of folks voted. We'll just leave this open for a moment. If there are a few people who have noted they may not see the poll, for those of you who are using Apple tablets or phones to view the webinar this evening, this software does not interface as well with those, so apologies on that front. I'm now going to close the poll, and let's see the results. It looks like 52% feel that they could do a school project. 53% feel they could do a community project. No one who's listening this evening feels that the challenges are too great to do any project, which is wonderful. And 69% would like to know more about conducting projects.
Great. That's wonderful. And Bruce, you might as well just say right now what you were telling me earlier about the stewardship community proposals, or are you going to talk more about that at the end?
Well, I'll be happy to take a moment right now, just a moment, and say that part of the NOAA Climate Stewards project involves individuals, educators, both formal and informal, submitting pre-proposals to us, and those that we accept for a climate adaptation or mitigation project, we organize into a community of peers that then get to work over the course of 4 and 5 months to refine their project proposals for submission. And usually at the very beginning of the summer, individuals are given the opportunity to submit their formalized proposals that they've reviewed with peers and with peer mentors, and they can submit it to us to conduct a project. And if the project is accepted, we have provided up to, and on a few occasions more than $2,000 per project. So if people are interested in that process, they can just Google NOAA Climate Stewards Project. They'll get to our website, and we will be having more information about how to join up to the stewardship community and gain potential funding for projects and advice on how to organize and implement projects in late October. So stay tuned. And thank you for that opportunity, Martha.
Yeah, that's perfect. I mean, it fits right in. That's exactly what these teachers were doing. So great. We'll continue now with our third category, which refers to misconceptions and conflicting worldviews. I think those are two things that make climate change education really challenging. And the papers that we were reading suggested that educators can help learners think about the way they think and generate more sufficient understandings. I don't know if this is a very common practice for science educators, but I don't recall a teacher ever doing this with me when I was in school. So I think it might represent an area where we could improve. We could think better about how to do this. So let me show you some examples that are in this category. So here was a study from California where researchers explored the nature of student conversations. The teachers were trained to facilitate the discussion with questions like, how do you know? Or, what is the evidence for climate change? The more students engaged and interacted with other students or the teacher, the more they learned and changed their level of concern. And one thing I find interesting is that environmental educators have a really strong history of respecting the variety of values and opinions about topics that involve ethical dilemmas, for example. Here you have people applying some of those same strategies to what we might think of as factual science. And so that's mixing things up in a new way for me. Because it's possible to construe and construct different ideas than what the communicator intended, it may be that this is going to be a useful strategy for helping bring worldviews that are conflicting with each other into the classroom and helping students make sense out of it. Here's another example. These teachers were from Italy, and they used discussions, questions, to guide students' thinking so that they were realizing what the students know and what they don't know and how they could better know what they know. These were 5th grade students, and the excerpts of the discussions were really quite sweet as they were in their discussion groups trying to figure out what they knew and why that could be or couldn't be. They were challenging each other and deciding, well, no, even if the Earth's core was heating up the climate, that wouldn't explain atmospheric carbon, and we've seen no increase in volcanic activity, so they couldn't connect the dots. So they decided to abandon that line of thinking. Now, it took some prompting from teachers to do that, but they actually decided to change their ideas about climate change. So here's another example where they were using worksheets in one study to simplify concepts and guide students through discussions. Now, that may sound easy to just use a worksheet, but the kinds of worksheets they were developing could only be developed by educators who understood both the underlying cause of the misconception and the scientific explanation so well that they could simplify it into a worksheet and convey that information. So now we're back to our last question. This was category 3, and I'm curious about the degree to which this aligns with what you currently teach, or how you could imagine you could teach this way, or whether or not you see value in this style, or think everybody should be doing this.
The polls are open for everyone. For those of you who may not be as familiar with dispelling misconceptions, we did a webinar just a few months ago that focused on this very subject. And this webinar is archived on our Google Archives site, so feel free to go and access it and have a look at it. I think that you'll be pleased. We'll just leave the poll open for just a few moments. Oh, one educator says, can you clarify point 3 again?
Sure. Point 3 is the idea that educators need to help students understand what they know and why they know it and how they know it and what it means to know it. So it's more of a constructivist approach to education, and asking a lot of questions like, why do you think that? And looking at a graph and saying, what does this graph show us? What does that mean? Why is that evidence of climate change? And just probing over and over again.
Okay, and so we've got most votes in. If you'd like to just take another moment to vote, then we're just going to close the polls up. Okay, and our results are showing that about 5% says this is not how I teach. 70% say that they could imagine learning more about this. 40% say that they already teach in this way. 17% say even though it's not my style, I see its value. And 41% acknowledge that we all need to be teaching this way. And before I close up with this, one of our educators notes that this process that you're talking about is also referred to as metacognition, and she has said that she has found a great YouTube video from a professor at Samson University regarding the importance and value of metacognition in education and learners. And Terry, I'll be waiting for you to send me a link to that so I can send it out to everyone before we end today.
Great. Thank you, Terry. That's very helpful. Okay, so what I thought I'd do is wrap up what the 49 papers say and then show you an example of how I can imagine you. So the summary is that we reviewed 49 papers and synthesized them into 6 themes, and then I've collapsed them into 3 categories. And those categories are that climate science is conveyed by using relevant impacts and engaging activities and data collection or analysis processes, sometimes with interaction with scientists. Climate change education includes project work, which can be in the classroom or the community, when those 2 activities build skills for solving problems and taking action. And educators can model their thinking and help students explore what they think and why to help overcome misconceptions and critique perspectives. I think it might be worth considering whether any of these goals will ultimately be successful independent of the others, or we say that quality climate change education must endeavor to include all 3 of these components. So if we think about what would happen if we converted these to themes, if we convert the themes into characteristics, we could use these to make a rubric and critique our climate change education programs. Of course, any one program may have difficulty using all these strategies simultaneously, but in general, if a topic focuses on local meaningful impacts with engaging activities, if the students can collect data or interact with scientists, if students can plan a project and share their knowledge and demonstrate change, and if the process of doing these things enables students to reflect on what they know and how they know it, then we've probably got a good climate change program. So here's a program that I was involved with, and it's part of a Project Learning Tree secondary module called Southeastern Forest and Climate Change. First, students learn about the carbon cycle. They become a carbon molecule. It's an activity that you've probably seen in other places. They go around the classroom and then create a design of carbon cycle. But then we took a little bit further and had students measure the height of trees and the diameter of trees and calculate how much carbon was in that forest, and then calculate how much carbon they produce as consumers and connect that to how much atmospheric carbon is not being sequestered by the landscapes in their own state. And then they also explored carbon in various products, including wood products, and thought about if they have choices as a consumer to pick one thing or another, is that better or worse for atmospheric carbon? So if we use a bit of a rubric to look at all those goals, we would say that, well, yeah, it's local, meaningful, it was engaging, experiential, they collect and analyze data, and so we did quite well on that score. There was no class project, but there could have been a class project. It would depend on how much time the teacher had and how important it would be to figure out how to do a class project for this. Whether or not it actually the students discussed what they know and how they know it and reflected on what it means, would really be a function of the instructor and how they were able to teach. And so in some ways, we've got instructional resources that can guide these first three categories, and community resources that can make the class project easier or harder on a teacher, and professional development and preparation that may be a function of how well the teacher is able to in this teaching styles. And so we've got all three components that need to be working together for quality climate change education, which takes the onus off the teacher a little bit and puts it on everybody else for a change. So I think that what we've got going on here is an opportunity for good science education to be melded with good environmental education, and then a process of evolving to create better educators and better instructional materials in high quality education. And I don't know that we ever would have gotten to this kind of a result if we looked at wildlife or habitat or recycling or some other more mundane environmental issue. This may be how climate change education can help make education better in a number of ways. So more information about the study that I just mentioned. It has recently been published in Environmental Education Research, and you can it's not in print, so it's not in your library, but it is online. So you can access it online. And NAAEE, the North American Association for Environmental Education, is using this activity as a part of their EE Works program. So their website has, if you go to naaee.org and then look around for EE Works, you will be able to find a link to climate change education, this activity, and you will find the list of the 49 papers that we reviewed and the abstracts, so you can decide if you want to read any of those in more detail. And in the coming months, there will be more information from this study on their website. So, oops, there we go. That's all I have. I've noticed this little corner here. So I imagine Bruce has a bunch of questions that he would like to have us all discuss. And I would like to thank not only the NOAA Climate Stewards Program, but also support from USDA NIFA for this research, and as well the North American Association for Environmental Education's EE Works project. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Monroe. I think that we do have quite a few questions that are on the line. And in fact, I may open up the microphone, which I'm going to do right now, to one of our other NOAA Climate Stewards coordinators. I'll throw this over to you first, Dr. Monroe. One of our educators asks that they actually teach biology. She's a biology and chemistry teacher, and she'd like to incorporate projects that align both with her curriculum and climate change. Can you make any recommendations as to where she can find some ideas or other information?
Well, I'm sure the NOAA Climate Stewards website has a number of things, and the CleanNet database has a wide variety of resources. But that material that I mentioned, Southeastern Forest and Climate Change, is available to download online. I will, let's see, can I type in this? If I type, will everybody be able to see this, Bruce?
Absolutely. Everyone's watching your screen.
Okay, well, maybe I better not talk and type at the same time.
Okay.
So I will type in that URL and make sure it's correct and hit the button. But that is the Project Learning Tree secondary module. It was designed for biology, useful. We're biology teachers, AP biology teachers, environmental science, and AP environmental science teachers. It's 14 activities that apply climate change science to forest ecosystems. And the web version has ways to adapt it outside the southeastern United States. So much of it is very transferable. And that may be a place to start. And then that resource has loads of links to other places as well.
Yeah, all of these are excellent recommendations, and I cannot stress enough. One thing that Dr. Monroe said is that there is an online group called CleanNet, and if you type that into your browser, cleannet.org, it should pop up. And there is an online community with an active listserv, so that if you are an educator looking for ideas and recommendations or scientists to work with, it is one excellent place to start, as well as, and you know, I'm just going to plug it again, the NOAA Climate Stewards Education Project. If you have thoughts, you have ideas, or you want some recommendations, we can certainly help you out. One question that was asked, Dr. Monroe, and I'm just looking to find it over here, if you give me one moment to go through a bunch of these questions, is what modifications might you recommend for an adult audience versus the classical sort of K through 12 audience that your papers have referred to?
Well, one thing that is, I mean, it isn't really a modification if we just use the guidelines of relevant, interesting, personal. It just means that adult audiences might find different things relevant, meaningful, and personal than what a K through 12 audience would find. So still the same thing applies in terms of what they're interesting and meaningful and engaging them. And I think particularly if people aren't convinced about climate change, then having them do phenology data collection and look at their own data or compare their data to what somebody else collected 10, 15, 20 years ago, then they'll start to own that idea of change is real and things are happening. And so some of this would be exactly the same, it's just the strategies and the topics might change a little bit. I think you'd be less likely to get them to do a classroom project, but I think adults, at least I know adult groups like faith-based groups that have adult education programs, or nature centers that have member programs, or extension offices that have workshops for adults. There are people that hang around afterwards and say, I want to do something about this. What can I do? And linking together in a community action project is point number 2. That would be perfect. In Australia, they have a program called Sustainability Street. And a street could actually be a physical street. It could be people who live on the same street. But it could also be a group of people at work or a group of people who know each other some other way. And they work to encourage a lower carbon economy and help each other think about what they can do and give support to each other in doing it. So there's a lot of personal behavior change that can happen as a result of adults thinking about this and supporting each other.
Thanks. Those are all really good. One other plug that I'd like to make for ideas and also seeing some action-based project is a website called Climate Change Live. And if you go to that, you'll see some really good input and ideas from other folks in this area. You know, Dr. Monroe, one question that has been asked did any of the interventions take place in disciplines outside of the hard sciences, such as the humanities or sociology or art?
Oh, now you're making me think. The remote sensing study that I mentioned in the beginning was a university person who was in geography, not in science. The elementary activities that had to do, it was actually an elementary program where they had the kids write public service announcements. That wasn't necessarily a hard science. That was 5th grade. That was just 5th grade. But the vast majority of them were related to science. And in fact, not the majority, but a great number of the articles came from science journals. So that's who's doing research on climate change education, which is not, it's not unusual. You sort of, that's who would write about it. There's plenty of stuff going on out there that doesn't end up in the peer-reviewed literature, as I'm sure you know.
Yes, and for those of you who are interested in reading about some other activities that may not have been picked up by Dr. Monroe's search, on the NOAA Climate Stewards Education website, we have a link to an entire magazine, a publication by the North American Association of Earth Science Educators, which focuses on activities that educators, both formal and informal, had done with students and with the public in order to both raise awareness, to mitigate, and to adapt to impact of climate change. So you can find that. And also, just as another note, for those of you who are interested in finding out more about interventions relating to climate change that are not taking place strictly in a hard sciences sort of classroom environment and more in the social sciences or humanities, you should show up to our October 2nd webinar, which is going to focus on that aspect as well. Let's see some other questions that we have here. Lisa Kern, she asks that she would love to get more information on how to use GIS and remote sensing in her classes. Do you have any suggestions on how to get started?
Well, it's a little outside my area, but I do recall that the Minnesota Geography Teachers Association has resources about GIS, and so your state association of social science or geography educators might have resources that would be local. You could also ask them to be a local university. I'm at a land-grant university, and we have an engineering school, and the engineering school has a surveying course, and there's people who teach GIS applications in geography and wildlife and in lots of different departments. So you may find somebody who would love to come to an education workshop and let folks know what's going on and how they can access it. Or maybe not, I don't know. Maybe somebody else has a suggestion.
Well, I tell you, if anyone has any other suggestions, please type them into the question box. I know that there are a lot of individuals that are on this evening that are providers and developers of climate change education resources and materials, and not just educators that are using them within either formal or informal classroom settings. I will take the time to, I don't know if I can get this done within a week, but I will take the time to synthesize all these responses and get them out to everyone who's registered this evening as well. So if you do have some recommendations, as some people have been putting in, please offer them here. And you know what, why don't we take a moment for folks to do that, and what I will do at this time, or to come up with some other questions for Dr. Monroe, and I will take a moment to begin providing some additional resources for folks that have come out. So again, I've mentioned the Climate Stewards edition of the Earth Scientist, where one can find lots of resources on potential projects. There are some excellent best practices from the National Center for Science Education for teaching climate change. We have already mentioned, I believe several times, the CLEAN Network, the Climate Literacy and Energy Awareness Network. There are some excellent education resources that are searchable by grade band as well as resource type. Climate Generation, which is an unbelievably high-level organization based out of Minnesota. They have a wonderful climate change and energy curricula that is also tied into the next generation science standards, engaged in using 3 dimensions of learning for their programs. And of course, as Dr. Monroe has mentioned, the North American Association for Environmental Education, NAAE EE Pro, is a site which has many other resources, and you can coordinate and interact with a climate change education group as well as climate change education resources. And I would be very remiss if I did not mention the NSTA, National Science Teachers Association, Climate Sciences Resources. And you don't have to copy all of these down. As I've mentioned, you will be receiving a video archive of this. And yes, I'm sorry, Dr. Monroe.
Sorry, Bruce, I just see one question on here about the carbon cycle game, and you're right, there's lots of numbers out there and it can be really confusing because some researcher might say, okay, there's this much carbon in trees and plants and this much in the ocean in our state or in our continent or in the world, and so things are just very, I mean, it's hard to get good data. We got our numbers from the Woods Hole scientists. And one place you can go for definitive numbers that many scientists will agree with is the IPCC reports. And all that's online. Bruce, you probably can rattle off the URLs for the National Science Academy. Oh, there's that booklet with 20 questions and all the data that answers. Now I can't remember the title, but that's great data also.
Another recommendation that I would make for folks, if they have not yet seen it, if they're interested in getting in touch with some scientists, is the National Climate Assessment, or NCA. If you actually go into the whole report and not just the overall viewings, you can see the authors and the agencies that they're from, and then you can you can get in touch with them, and many of the authors are really terrific about offering their time to you. I just want to, for those folks who came in a little late, I just want to cover 1 or 2 more slides before we end the recording, but we can still take questions, and we'll continue to record those questions for you. I'd like everyone to please go check your mail. You've received a link to our post-webinar poll. As soon as we're done, just go and complete it. Just do it right now. It will take you certainly less than 2 minutes, maybe even less than a minute if you click very quickly. And I also wanted to remind everyone that the next NOAA Climate Stewards discussion group, the Teacher-Friendly Guide to Climate Change, which is an excellent resource providing the scientific aspects of climate change, how climate works, why scientists think it's changing, the science and engineering behind steps that would mitigate climate change and enable humans to adapt to changes that occur. That's going to be going on Monday, September 25th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. And Peg Steffen will be leading that discussion. Get in touch with her, and she will be sure to send you questions that we're going to be talking about that evening, and it's a great way to interact with other educators that have engaged in this process. Also, for those of you who are interested, Monday, October 2nd at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time will be the next Climate Stewards webinar, and we're focusing on climate communication, teaching the science and rhetoric of climate change, integrating both teaching of climate within hard science classes that one normally thinks of, as well as humanities and other types of classes as well. And just before I close the recording, but we'll still continue with taking questions and discussions, it's back to school. It's tough, but it's fun. And always remember that you should be having as much fun as your kids are, and I hope that you are. With that, I'm going to end our recording for this evening, though we'll continue to take questions from folks. And Dr. Monroe will stay on the line, and I'd like to say just thank you so much for participating in the NOAA Climate Stewards webinar. Please go to our website, and if you would like to see more of what we do, sign up to our e-list, and you can always contact us. And with that,